welcome to the ASC's panel discussion on diversity in corporate Canada and the role of the securities regulator. My name is Samir Sabrawal. I'm the General Counsel at the Alberta Securities Commission. We're pleased to host this discussion in conjunction with the ICD's Calgary and Edmonton chapters, and we'd like to thank all of you for joining us today. Before I start, I would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the traditional territories of the Indigenous peoples of the Treaty 7 region and Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. We respect the histories, languages, and cultures of First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and all First Peoples of Canada, whose presence continues to enrich our community. In 2016, the ASC adopted disclosure requirements that require companies to disclose specific information regarding gender diversity practices and policies as they relate to boards and executive management. Most of the members of the CSA have implemented these disclosure requirements. In recent years, several developments have occurred in both Canada and jurisdictions across the globe that have heightened the focus on diversity within segments of society, including the corporate environment. These developments have sparked ideas and conversations aimed at advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion on multiple fronts. One of the results of these widespread conversations is that consideration is being given to whether revising gender diversity disclosure requirements in securities laws should be done to focus on diversity more broadly. Earlier this year, the ASC conducted one-on-one consultations to allow us to have in-depth discussions with numerous stakeholders to understand the variety and substance of the perspectives on the issues that arise vis-a-vis the intersection of broader diversity considerations and capital markets. Today's discussion is intended to be a conversation during which we explore the key issues that surface when we talk about pursuing broader diversity within the boardrooms and senior management ranks of corporate Canada, and the benefits and challenges that accompany that pursuit. Although there are some different issues raised as between diversity and senior management and amongst boards, there are some broad commonalities, and that's where we'll be focusing on our conversation today. Our goal at the end is to have a frank, open, and honest conversation, after which all of us leave with a richer and more robust understanding of the issues and perspectives. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge Trudy Curran, co-chair of the Calgary chapter of the ICD, as well as the folks at both the ICD's Calgary chapter and Edmonton chapter, for their efforts and expertise in arranging today's panel discussion. On behalf of the ASC, thank you very much. I'm going to introduce our panelists today, and in order to maximize the amount of time we can spend on the substantive issues, I'll only briefly introduce each of them, and forgive me if I don't do each of them justice in being so brief. But if you haven't already had the chance, I would encourage you to visit the ASC's webpage for this event to learn more about each of them. First, Judith Atide is an accomplished corporate director, entrepreneur, professional engineer, and certified corporate director. She brings 30 years of professional and governance experience to board discussions. Bob Dillon is the founder and president and CEO of Main Street Equity Corp, which is based in Calgary, Alberta, and is publicly traded on the TSX. Mr. Dillon also sits on numerous boards. Keith Martell is the president and chief executive officer and a director of First Nations Bank of Canada. Mr. Martell is a current and past director of numerous corporate companies. And lastly, certainly not least, Sarah Race is a highly accomplished corporate director who currently sits on the boards of Loblaws, Ritchie Brothers, and Commercial Metals. I'd like to welcome each of you to today's panel discussion, and I'd like to thank each of you for taking the time to be with us today and to share your perspectives. I'm going to jump right into the substance because I want to make sure we have enough time for a robust discussion amongst our panelists. We know that there is significant interest in this topic from investors, proxy advisory firms, and other interested stakeholders. But before we get into the question about the role of securities regulators, I'd like to start by asking about experiences of our panelists. And I'd like to start with you, Sarah, if I can. Are the stakeholders that we've talked about asking companies for additional information on diversity more broadly? And if so, what information are they asking for, and what does the engagement with these folks look like?
Sure, and I'm happy to answer that. And thank you, Samir and ASC, for sponsoring this. I think it's important first that I give you the perspective that I come with. So the boards that I'm on are between 6 billion and 34 billion market cap. So they're large companies. Each one of them have over 50% diversity on the board. Some of them are as high as almost 65%. And each has some representation of racial diversity also. So clearly my boards and I very much believe in the value of diversity, and that would be the perspective that I come from. I'm also going to, though, mention my husband is very involved in venture, and he did some homework for me to get a little bit of an opinion from the venture firms also. So let me start with my personal perspective. Absolutely, the investors are asking. Each of my boards have had some engagement with the investors. One was the entire board with BlackRock talking about best practices, some of which was around diversity. One was where I had an interface with all of our major shareholders around a strategy and compensation issue, but the conversation definitely morphed into diversity and the value of diversity on board and management, both gender as well as racial diversity. And one board where the investors have directly said you need to put a Black member on your board. So depending on the company, depending on the conversations, each one of the boards have had those kinds of conversations. I also would like to add that in each of the companies, it's an important employee factor also. Each of the companies have employees engaged around diversity in some way, shape, or form, and it's important to them both from a attraction and retention standpoint. And then from a customer standpoint, depending on the board that I'm on and the types of customers, the customers are actually asking about that. And for the larger companies, suppliers are now getting engaged in that. So it really is an entire stakeholder matter that is very important for each of my boards. And I think on the size of the boards that I'm on, it probably is pretty standard across Canada. From a venture standpoint, the comments were quite different. The comments were around, we are trying to survive. We're trying to get funding. Cost of, regulations and going public are high. We're trying to deal with, wash trading, which people may know also as, algorithmic, I can't speak, algorithmic or programmatic trading. And so the perspective was quite different to say, geez, it's not that we don't value diversity, it's just to try and pile additional regulations or disclosure around that is just not what we're focused on right now. We're really focused on, survival. And so the perspectives between the two types of boards was quite different. So I just thought I would add that also.
Well, I appreciate that very much, Sarah.
May I jump in, Samir?
Sorry, please go ahead, Judith.
Thank you. So I serve on a number of boards, and I would say that some of my boards have had a diverse board, gender parity, very near gender parity for many, many years. And they've got great diversity of ethnicity, of age, of geography, and they're working and thinking about diversity of, that includes Indigenous peoples and Black peoples, and they've signed to the Black North Initiative and sexual orientation. And other of my boards are much, much earlier in the journey. I'd say they all are thinking about diversity, thinking about how to increase diversity, really coming at it from the perspective of if we have diverse directors with different experiences, then we have better decision making and better business outcomes. But I don't have that same experience as Sarah, where none of my boards have been approached by investors or stakeholders and said, you need to increase the diversity of your board. I do serve on a board where investors have said, we'd like you to think about beefing up certain skills, but it was about a skill set based on strategy, based on the future, but not around diversity. So that's been my experience.
Sorry, Keith, I think, I know you've got something to share, but I believe you're on mute.
Sorry, I didn't think I was that old to make that mistake, but and that's not an old diversity problem, obviously. I think the one experience I've had is that the discussion with CCGG, the Canadian Council of Good Governance, and their perspective on discussing diversity with the board was really, as Judith mentioned, it was in regards to good governance and board effectiveness. How are you ensuring that you've got diversity of thought in your board and bringing that to the table in making the best decisions, for shareholders in respect to governance? So, it is becoming a discussion, I think. I think CCGG probably would lead with that kind of discussion. But I did like the fact that discussion was in regards to how do you get better governance, not simply how do you just deal with diversity offside of good governance.
And I'm totally with you on that. I do think that that's exactly how it should be approached. And I would say most of the interactions that I've had have been approached from that standpoint also.
Well, thank you for that, Bob. I'm going to ask you to weigh in now at this time.
I have a different point of view on it. End of the day, running a business and diversity isn't just a buzzword, it's a necessity. So if you really want to grow your business or your workforce, or if you're a mining company in Saskatchewan who wants to sell potash to India and you don't have representation, it's not going to happen. Now, in terms of your question directed towards me, which is a CEO and a board member at Main Street Equity Corp, we've never been asked this question except once, simply because 50% of our executives are female gender and 40% of our directors are visible minorities. So it'll be a muted question to ask us from day one, and not before diversity and inclusiveness became popular. This was from 20 years listed on the Toronto Stock Exchange. We were inclusive, diverse. In fact, it worked against me because they used to call us an ethnic shop. And in fact, investment bankers used to come to me and say, hey, listen, you need to hire old stock Canadian as a president if you want to increase your multiple and have a bigger exposure. So I never had the same experiences like everybody else on this. We were, in fact, a little too inclusive and too, what do you call, diverse. And we were the market leader. The market leaders is the wrong word. We were HR leaders on LGBT, and also from customer standpoint. We had an outreach program. Maybe we were ahead of our time 20 years ago.
Well, that was part of the reason we put together this panel, Bob. And so I thank you for sharing a different perspective. Is we did want everyone to bring the real world to the table, what they're experiencing out there, what kind of conversations are happening. A lot of the conversations we are hearing on this are very much about principles, but not always about what's happening at the board table. So I really want to thank all of you for drawing on your experience at the tables you actually sit at to share with us what the engagement looks like. So you've talked a little bit about, each of you, about what's flowed out of the engagement. Let me ask you to maybe give us a little more detail about, once the conversation happens, whether it's about board diversity, whether it's about diversity within senior management, or even about the workforce, what happens? What does the next step look like? What are the actions that flow from that? Have the companies that you've been associated with undertaken greater efforts? Have they taken some sort of training? And I'd like you to really think about and share with us, things that you thought were successful and things that you thought represented challenges in the course of addressing some of the issues we just talked about. And if I could ask Keith for you to start, that would be wonderful.
Sure. So maybe I'll start with the first thing that tends to hit the table when you start talking about this issue. And I think Bob sort of alluded to it, is that people address meritocracy as the first issue. Like, we only hire on merit. We judge based on skills, experience, and that's why our board is the way it is. That's why our management team the way it is. That's why our employee group is the way it is. And we're absolutely colorblind. And, the reality is none of us are colorblind. We all have an innate ability to overjudge people who look like us. Bob probably has more South Asian people in his staff because he identifies with them and can see their skill and talent easier than others can. And that's just the reality of human nature. And so if you want to, so you have to face the fact that meritocracy discussion is probably the first thing you're going to have, and you have to deal with that. But it really has to turn into an affirmative meritocracy discussion. And it's where, yes, we understand that we hire on merit. We hire for skills. We all recognize that we want the most experienced, the most talented, the most skilled, the most connected board. And we want a diverse board. And you have to recognize that you may not be identifying diversity that has all those other things and brings you a different perspective. And if you can open up that discussion, it erases the fact that, well, there's nobody of this, that, or those things that is fitting the kind of skills we need to run our company. So that's the first thing. You have to get over that discussion about meritocracy, and companies that do this well get over that first discussion. Then I think the real issue is, I think as others have alluded to, you have to recognize that diversity of thought, diversity of contact, diversity of perspective is helpful for the company. If you're running a company that only has one type of customer, only one type of employee, only one type of stakeholder that gives you social license, then maybe you can get away with only one type of director. But in today's world, there's very few, if any, companies left that don't sell to, employ, engage, get social license from different perspectives in society. And if you don't have that perspective on your board and your management team and in your employee group, I think you're not doing good service to your company. So I think the first thing you have to do is recognize that you have to have that hard discussion about what is the skill and talent. But you see so many companies, in the management team or in the board that look all the same, and it's natural. They draw from the pools of people they know. They judge people based on their own experience. If you can really get down to what are the specific skills, talents, and connections we need, and what is the diversity connections we need, then you can really do justice to your company's needs.
Thanks. I appreciate that, Keith. Judith, I wonder if you might share with us your thoughts.
Thank you. I love where you started, Keith. I love the fact that you put merit on the table. I think the securities regulator should consider banning the word merit when we're talking about diversity, because we have this false question or false construct that says either you have merit or you have diversity. And that's not true. You have both. And I see that on the screen today. And while I can't see our participants, I am confident that there's merit and diversity embedded in the same people. So I think we need to get rid of the term merit as an explanation for why we haven't increased diversity on boards. I really like what you said, Keith, but I think one of the things that I'm observing is that the whole conversation about diversity and measuring diversity is relatively new to us. While we've talked about Comply Explains since 2016 for Alberta and 2014 federally, the reality is it's only been the last couple of years that there has been real demand for understanding the diversity, not just at the board table, and obviously gender is easy, but diversity throughout the organization. And so I think we're starting to put our arms around what does diversity mean, and every organization may be defining it slightly differently, but what does diversity mean? How do we collect it and how do we use it? And I think that's some of the challenges we're facing. Even the organizations that I serve on, where we are at 50% women and we have some ethnicity and so on, we're still trying to understand what does diversity really mean and how do we collect it and how do we analyze and use it.
And I'll add that I'm not sure any of my boards have done anything particularly different through the engagements, but I do think it has become more, we've become more aware that having policies and goals that are, we're willing to communicate externally as well as internally are important symbols of role modeling, how we value the diversity. So I do think that's, and I think the other thing most boards have come to recognize or will come to recognize is that you're not going to get diversity if you're just looking for CEO candidates, not in the near future. And hopefully eventually that will be the case. But and so really looking at the criteria, what is it that you really need? How many CEOs do you really need? How many people from your industry do you really need? Really looking at what are the skills you need based on your business model, based on your strategy and where you're headed, and to do what I consider to be an annual review of, has your strategy changed? Has your need changed? Do you need to do some refreshment of your board based on where you're headed? Each of my boards do that kind of annual review and do make changes based on that, but it's all about skills. And diversity is part of what we look at in trying to create a broad set of criteria that we're looking for. And the other thing I think we all probably have to do is not just utilize our current networks, not just utilize recruiters. Like there's a whole bunch of resources out there that are available to us. And I will tell you, as we look broader and broader, there's an amazing array of diversity candidates, all of whom don't want to be token members of a board. They're serious candidates that have been adding tremendous value. So I think that's more what we've been finding as we continue down the journey of diversity and the value on the board.
So Bob, I'm getting a sense that you like to have the last word. So looks like you got a shot at it again.
Thank you, Samir. At a 30,000-foot level, fabric of this nation is changing, and it's changing rapidly, and racism is losing and diversity is winning. So I agree with Keith, we are comfortable with our own kind sometimes, but there's another element that you didn't touch on or I have a view on, is it's also a network. Who run public companies, who run these pension funds, hedge funds, all the directorship are all stock rich Canadians. They go to their private schools, hang out with their private companies. The control blocks of these shareholders or the pension funds are familiar with not only culturally, they are interconnected from the day they were born. So, but this is changing. And it's evolving, and that's something that's hard to change through regulations and awareness and taking us to the next level, and eventually we'll hit utopia. But that's a very important part of it. It's not cultural. It's also it's self-interest.
I appreciate
if I can add just one point to that, it's sort of related to Bob's comment. I think, the worst thing that can happen, though, is for people to use diversity as a box checking exercise. And that goes to Bob's point. It's simply people not doing the work that it takes to find diverse candidates. Because as I think Sarah said, they're everywhere out there. You just need to spend the time looking. If you're quite, shall I use the word lazy, and you only pick from people then I think you don't get diversity. But the worst thing if we tell people they need to do diversity and they rush out there to find a candidate, I'm really opposed to that, because I think it does two things. It creates the possibility that you create a single constituent candidate who only is seen as the person of color or the woman or the First Nations person, and all issues like that we push to them, which is not fair to them and not the best interest of the company. And you create the perspective that even if they have that skill or talent that Sarah talks about, you create, and I found a phrase that I like. It's called the turtle on a post. If you see them, they were put there, and you don't know how they got there, and you don't know how they're going to get down. So we don't want that, because it limits the ability of that maybe skilled director to really blossom into all aspects of the company's governance. And it also doesn't do the best thing for the company, because it removes the need for all directors to deal with all of these diverse issues. Male directors should be concerned about female employment. And that's not just a female issue. So it's a company issue. So I think that's one of the things we have to try and avoid. And that's something that I have concern with all the discussion about diversity, like sessions like this, is that people rush out and say, we need a box to check, instead of do the hard work to get there.
And when you check off the box, you're creating polarization. You're creating, in this case studies, affirmative action in place other parts of the world has not worked. So the natural evolution on doing the right thing, like Keith mentioned, is a proper channel on elevating it. But I go back to my original point. We also have a social network issue that is very difficult to break through. Glass ceilings. It's economic glass ceilings. Some of our immigrants didn't go to private school, and we don't have memberships at private clubs. If you go to the petroleum club, how many visible minorities do you see there? Or gender. But one positive thing that came out of our organization, because we had a reputation as being non-racist, racist companies avoided us, and inclusive companies came to us to do more business. And that graph was like a hockey stick phenomenon in the last decade, or especially the last 5 years. So that's a positive thing, that we attracted a lot of new generation of inclusive suppliers, vendors, investors, which we never did 5 years ago.
So I really like the turtle on a post. I hadn't heard that before, Keith. I'm going to take that away. Somebody put it there, and it's only going to go down. So thank you for that. But I also really like what Sarah and Bob are saying, which is stop fishing in the same pond, fish in other ponds than the one you're swimming in. And whether that be looking for different genders, different ethnicities, different training. If you're looking for, a CPA, a lawyer, an engineer, go out into those organizations or into those membership organizations and look for the candidates. Those candidates are there, whether it be training, geography, ethnicity. It just means taking a breath and looking a little further than the pond you're swimming in. So I really like what all three of you have said.
Well, that was great, because it's going to let me lead right into my next question. But before I do want to remind folks in the audience that there is a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We encourage you to put your questions in. There will be time at the end of this conversation. We have specifically built in some time to take a look at those questions and try to address them amongst our panelists. So I'm going to try and build on what all of you have just said, which was talking about the other things that need to be done, that it isn't just about regulation, or maybe in some cases there's a hesitancy about having any regulation in respect of this particular area, but that there are other things that need to be and can be, and in some cases are already being done. And I do want to now turn to the idea about, well, what is the role of the securities regulator? This starting to sound like it's a multi-party, multifaceted approach that needs to be taken to address the question of diversity. So I want to explore a little bit about the securities regulator role, not surprisingly, because, well, that's where I work, and it's the ASC who is hosting this. So as I mentioned at the outset, there are current disclosure requirements that are limited to gender diversity. And so I guess my first question for you to think about is, one, should that be changed to address broader diversity? The second thing I'd like to ask you about is there are conversations about the use of targets and term limits as mechanisms to drive increased diversity. Are those appropriate? And should the regulators, securities regulators, be giving guidance on those issues? And then the last thing I'd like you to think about is currently this is the gender diversity disclosure requirements are focused or only apply to the non-venture issuers. And should that change? Should that apply to a broader scope of issuers? So if I can ask, because Bob, I'm going to take away your opportunity to go last this time by asking you to go first.
Samir, you've asked like 10 questions, but I'm going to try to paraphrase it from bits and pieces that I find important to me. Now, let me understand one of your questions is submit our religion, a sexual orientation, and an ethnicity to the government. That's what you're asking me, correct? You're a lawyer. I just want to clarify this.
And as a good lawyer, I will not answer your question. I will instead throw it back at you. I'm just kidding, Bob.
If that's accurate, that sounds like communism.
What I think, the suggestion that's out there, and this is, Bob, what I'm really trying to do is put out there the different perspectives that we're hearing as securities regulators. Some folks are suggesting that what should be done with the disclosure requirements, and it's not so much disclosure to the government for government tracking, but it's disclosure requirements for those folks who read the AIFs and the MD&A for reporting issuers about the policies, practices, and outcomes for reporting issuers. So that's the question on the table. Is that appropriate? And I do want you to share your perspective because that's what the point of this conversation is.
Yeah, thank you, Samir. And I realize where you're coming from, but end of the day, think about it for 1 second. What you've asked me is my sexual preference, my religion, what color I am. I just love this South Asian box that the people, like one day I got up and somebody told me I'm a South Asian. That's how it happened. From today, you're a South Asian. So now I check off a South Asian box because some regulator somewhere said I'm a South Asian. Okay, and where does a disclosure begin and where does it end, Samir? Like today, you've got half a dozen. You may have one question, and where does it end? Entering a box check-in world. Hasn't history taught us that this is extremely dangerous? And in the world of racism, like this is two different boxes here, right? We're dealing with racism, one bucket, and prejudice is a second bucket. Like you're confusing both questions. And regulation, it seems like a shortcut to solve prejudice. For example, drugs are outlawed. I hear every day opioid and people are dying of drugs and it's terrible what meth has done to a generation. That's a regulation. I think it's just so a lot of people say, I'm no longer racist or prejudiced. I'm inclusive. So let's put this box on. And we'll put some people, some brown guys or black guys or somebody who comes from a different religion or LGBT on the board. That's the direction I see it's going.
I think Bob did the equivalent of the mic drop, but Keith, have you got, you want to build on that or maybe offer a different perspective? I welcome that.
Yeah, I sort of alluded it to in my last comments. Though I think diversity. I think diversity is very important for all the reasons everybody on this panel has talked about. I think I sort of share some of the concern with the you got to report all the demographics of your board to a regulator. I share Bob's concern about that because it gets back to my concern about the check the box issue. But I do think I do like the idea of compelling companies to talk about how they're addressing diversity in order to serve their stakeholders, shareholders, employees, social license issuers, and that's all about And I tried when this panel met to prepare for this. I tried to think of the most Caucasian male thing that we could have. Like if you run a company that only sells, khaki golf shorts, maybe you can get away with an all male, white, older board, but but your supplier is probably not going to be white males, and probably your employees aren't going to be white males. So, it just gets back to my whole earlier discussion. There are very few instances where a company could justify having zero diversity on their board. But historically, you look at Canadian companies, there's been Canadian companies where a director retires and they appoint their son, typically the son, as the successor candidate. And that's swimming in a very narrow pool. So I think the disclosure requirements I'd like to have is companies explaining how they're dealing with getting the best boards. And if you can't explain how diversity is part of getting the best boards, you have a problem.
And I'm going to add to that because I'm pretty similar. Look, if you're not looking widely, if you're not looking for diversity candidates who have different backgrounds, different ethnicities, ages, genders, sexual orientations, you're not getting the best talent. And we're all trying to get the best talent to make our companies be the best they can possibly be. So in my mind, it's a no-brainer. What I like about disclosure is it forces us to think about it. It forces us to think about our strategy and where we're headed and what we need to be successful, and therefore how diversity plays a role in that, and causing some sort of disclosure around that, encourages that kind of thinking on an ongoing basis. And so I think that's all very good. I'm probably not a believer that things have to be regulated. I like more of a disclosure or comply or explain type of approach than quotas. I just am against quotas as a general rule because of the things that all three of our other panelists have said. But
Sarah, what are you disclosing? That's my concern.
Yeah, here's what I'd like to disclose. Here's the types of skills we have. Here's why we look for the types of skills that we have. Here's how those skills actually help us achieve our accomplishments. Maybe diversity is part of representing the employees that we have. 50% of our employees are Hispanic. Why wouldn't we want to represent that in the board? Maybe our customers are 80% females. So if we're going to try and really meet the needs of our customers, so it's that kind of disclosure that I'm looking for, is really thinking strategically about your company, where you're headed, what kinds of skills and reflections of your customers, employees, et cetera, do you need? Does that clarify that for you?
Well, Sarah, if you go a step beyond that, and I agree with what you're saying, but if you go a step beyond that my sexual preference, or I'm LGBT and that's why you should give me a board position, or I practice a different religion and whatnot, because my understanding is that's the direction we headed, is checking off 20 boxes. And if this algorithm is going to say you got majority of these boxes and now you're fit to be on this pension fund as a board member. Skill set I think that should be the norm. If we are still discussing skill set, that skill set is the reason you should be on this board or be a senior management or a CEO, we are doomed as an exchange. Like skill set is a first step. Like we at Main Street, mediocrity is number one. It's not if you're South Asian or East Asian or West Asian or whatever box you want to check off with. I'm saying the direction, where's the puck going, Sarah? The puck is going is we need to check off a box, and and who's got all the merits of the box. I'm not disagreeing with what you're saying.
Yeah, business and I'm not saying check off a box because I would be vehemently opposed to a check off the box exercise also.
I know, and you're exactly right. If your market is all Latins, you got to have somebody who understands their business. Or if potash is all getting exported to India, you got to have somebody who understands that. But that's not what we are discussing. We are discussing where the puck is going, and where the puck is going is a very dangerous zone. That's my view.
And for me, it's because I view this as a strategic issue associated with the success of your company, versus a regulated or a quota or a check the box kind of thing. I think you and I are probably more aligned than we're just using different verbiage, but I could be wrong.
I'm listening to the two of you, and I think you're vehemently agreeing. I really do think you're vehemently agreeing. You're just, as you're saying, approaching the same issues with slightly different terminology. You've asked a lot of questions here, Samir, and I'm trying to get my own head around all the questions you asked and which one do I want to take on. You asked about diversity disclosures. I think diversity is important for business outcomes. I think there's lots of research that shows that there's a correlation, even if not a causation, between diversity and results. And so I think diversity is important. A diversity of thought is what we're really trying to get at. And we do that through training, gender, age, geography, and a whole bunch of other things. So I think one of the things that we need to talk about is standardizing what is a standard definition of diversity. And I think that's where perhaps Bob is saying, here's how I think you're defining it, and Sarah's saying, here's how I think you're defining it. So I think that one of the things we need to talk about is having that standard definition of diversity. You asked about quotas and targets. I'm not sure I'm allergic to targets and quotas, and the reason being we already have them. We have hard targets. Any company that is incorporated under federal law or incorporated in Alberta already have to have a minimum of 25% Canadian residents. So we have a target. Audit committees need to have at least 50% independence. So we have soft targets. We already have those. So I'm not allergic to them. But I think that somewhere between where we started, the comply or explain disclosure requirement, and hard targets, there's probably a spot in the middle that looks like securities regulators joining others like the proxy advisors and the pension funds who have already been very verbal in saying, here's what we think is important. Diversity is important to drive business outcomes, and we want to see increased diversity at the board level. I think it's perfectly acceptable for the regulator to say, here is research-based information we're sharing with you, and we are asking you to disclose your diversity objectives, your schedule for achieving those objectives, and how you're going to get there, the mechanisms, and then allow every listed company to disclose those things, and investors and stakeholders can read it and say, that's reasonable or that's not reasonable. That's kind of where I'm coming from. I think there's a midpoint there. But if we're still having this conversation in 3 to 5 years, I'm probably on hard targets. And I don't know what those targets are, Bob.
Yeah, so sorry, I'll just add one point, because I do think we're all violently in agreement. I compare this same discussion to the sort of discussion about ESG targets or the discussion around sustainability. ESG targets are about a loose set of goals or objectives that nobody can really define how they're measured or what the right one is. Sustainability is a discussion about sustainability, which includes environment, social, and governance issues. And diversity is one of those governance issues. I'd much sooner the discussion around diversity center around the kind of discussion we've had about sustainability disclosure than about setting these ESG targets, which really people can't understand. And quite frankly, some registrants can really, through trickery and measurement, really qualify when really they're really doing really nothing to advance the interest of shareholders. So I think it's more discussion, but I'm with you, Judith. If we don't get any movement, then you've got to compel people to do what they should be doing anyways.
Samir, we forgot one important element in this. How about the shareholders? Shareholder base is changing, and they're becoming very inclusive, very diverse. It's international portfolio managers. It's not the local old boys network. They'll force the change. I think regulators if Judith is right, if the change doesn't happen, you may have to step in. But right now, the investors, that's why this exchange exists, is for the investors. They'll make the change happen.
And I'm with you, Bob. I think between our customers, our suppliers, our investors, and our employees, you got to get on the train. If you're going to get the best talent and get the best results for your company and your shareholders, you absolutely have to be headed in this direction.
And Sarah, what happens is if you regulate it, you may get unattended consequences. That's like box checking. It's already happening. It's natural evolution is happening. It's happening rapidly. What's happened in the last 2 years hasn't happened in the last 18 years I've been listed on the TSX. And some of the steps we've taken is we've taken a 2-page page on our annual report showing our diversity, gender, LGBT, religion, etc. We've done that. We were because it's good business. And the shareholders love it. That's why we did it. So I think, Samir, you need input from the shareholders before you regulate anything.
And I appreciate that, Bob. One of the things I think we're trying to do through this is exactly that, to understand what you're hearing directly from the shareholders. We would have certainly heard from some. What we wanted is that unfiltered conversation that perhaps is happening between investors and boards. So certainly that is an aspect of what we need to pay attention to. And as I said, we wanted to hear it from both angles, what we're hearing directly and what we know the boards are hearing as well. One thing I would ask each of you to maybe touch upon that we didn't really get into, which is scope of application of whatever disclosure requirements may be in place. Is it right to limit it to the non-venture issuers? Is it right to open it up to a broader scope of issuers? I would really appreciate if perhaps you could spend a couple of minutes each just on your thoughts on that particular topic. If I could ask, perhaps, Sarah, if I could ask you, I know you'd said you had sent your husband off to do some homework, so maybe we can all benefit from that homework.
I did send him off to do some homework because it's a different world than I am familiar with. And so he did contact a lot of people, and I would say that probably the conversations represented over 100 venture firms. To a T, they all said not one single shareholder is asking them about diversity. That doesn't mean that won't happen in the future. And I think I already mentioned that a lot of comments around the geez, we're just trying to get funding and survive. But I still personally believe that some recognition of the value of diversity could make a difference for venture firms. So, some sort of disclosure for me would be a good thing. I don't know that I think it has to be as strong as a non-venture firm based on everything I've heard from people who actually work in that world. But I'd really be interested in what other people have heard or think.
I think we already have disclosure requirements for both venture firms and non-venture firms, and an example would be financial disclosure. But the level of disclosure differs. And so I think it's appropriate that both listed and ventured firms provide diversity disclosure, maybe at a different level. And I think about it as, if you think of disclosure of financial data as the outcome of business decisions, then you can look at the disclosure of diversity matters as the input to business decisions. And so I think it's appropriate that both issuers essentially provide some level of disclosure.
That's probably where I'm at too, Judith.
Keith, would you like to jump in?
Yeah, I don't have a lot of exposure to the venture listed companies. I'd be mostly on the non-venture. I think our bank is a private company. We're a chartered bank in Canada, and 2 years ago we had more Indigenous directors on our board than every listed non-venture company in Canada combined. So I think there's niches in both venture and non-venture and private companies that focus on specific markets that, it can give other companies two things: a view that there are capable directors out there who can run small, medium, large size companies and be governors of those companies. And also that when you address diversity to the markets you're in, you'll find solutions. And I think that just speaks to everything we've already spoken about. So I sort of share the concern with venture companies who might be smaller and moving ahead and struggling to survive, that more regulation isn't helpful. But I think if it's helpful to their business, that they should probably be paying attention to it just like everybody else.
So at the risk of getting yelled at by Bob, I'm still going to ask Bob to maybe you can weigh in.
Mayor, what does it mean to call it venture? Venture exchange is very unique to Western Canada and Canada. It's startups like myself who started out in venture with very little capital, with very little regulation. $100,000, you are listed on the venture exchange that has the ability to exercise your entrepreneurial skill set. And we've lost that over the years. If you look at when we started out as venture, like some big companies on the TSX started out as venture. I'm one of them, and you know all the other ones. We've seen the regulations killing the venture exchange. And it's another, we talk about startup and entrepreneurs, and we talk about all that, but what's a lifeline of this, or a natural second step for an entrepreneur, is a venture exchange. We need to deregulate more on the venture. How does venture exchange start? Three buddies get together, they're 3 board members in a basement, they pool some money from friends and relatives, and they get listed with an idea. Do you want to regulate that idea? That's my question to you, Samir. Do you? What does the venture mean? Venture mean high speculation, and from the investor perspective, these guys who speculate on a penny stock, a 10-cent stock, and goes up to a couple of bucks in the old days in the oil and gas business. Then friends got together and they raised money in the venture, and they drilled a hole, and sometimes they hit. And the BC mining companies all started out as venture exchange because it was a little bit less regulated. And we're going to lose that. And don't lose the spirit, and don't kill the entrepreneur by regulating him to death. That's all I have to say.
No, and I appreciate that, Bob. And I think that, the question I'm putting is not so much a rhetorical one or one where the decision's been made, but genuinely trying to understand what the perspective is out there about the risks of applying it to a broader scope and the potential benefits, and just trying to understand what those look like. The point of all this is to try and gather as much information and understanding of perspectives as we move towards thinking about what the regime ought to look like in terms of what we're trying to drive as objectives, and what the potential risks are of going in particular directions. So I appreciate that perspective. I do want to leave some time for questions, so I'm going to ask one last question, and maybe some of this has already been captured by some of you throughout your comments, but I do want to have an opportunity to focus down on this particular question and to think about it, and to give you an opportunity to talk about it. What is the vision or the path forward on diversity in boardrooms and senior management in your mind? And I'm going to ask Keith, if you could start us off, I'd really appreciate that.
Yeah, and I'll keep it fairly short, because I think we've really talked a lot about these issues already. I think the path forward is that people recognize the value of diverse thought, and you get diverse thought through diverse boards, you get diverse thought through diverse management teams, and you get to operate if you can draw on talent pools widely for your employee base. We've talked about mining. For the most part, miners could assume in the past that all your underground people were going to be male. So most mining companies have single-sex washrooms. If you haven't dealt with that issue, there's a growing number of women in trades, women miners, and you simply can't operate if you don't try and attract talent from that pool. You just can't. So that's just a simple example of something that, you're not going to solve your employment problem. You're not going to be able to operate your mind if you don't deal with that diversity issue. And, females tend to point out that females like female washrooms, and that's sort of important. And if you've got, it goes back to my days when I was with a chartered accounting firm. And at that time, most of the graduates were male, but we started getting more than half the business school today are females. So we started in my career, I was a manager, and I started to see more and more female staff, great staff. And I had partners, which were all male, that didn't understand the female staff, and we kept losing them. And, we had to point out that, you got to change with the environment. So I think that going forward, the best companies are going to recognize that. I think what everybody said, the writing's on the wall. If you don't represent a diverse part of society in all aspects of your company, you're not going to do very well. And so I think that the best path forward, I think, is when people come to that realization. The people who don't get on the train tend to be left behind. They won't find the capital, they won't find the employees, and they're probably not going to find the best and most interested and engaged directors.
Thanks for that, Keith. I appreciate that. Sarah, I think I'm happy to let you speak now. I don't want to.
It's actually really similar. In my mind, it's our duty and it's the right thing to do to cast our nets wide and find the best possible talent that we can, to attract it, to retain it, to develop it. Every single level of the organization, right up to the board and right to the people we hire. And if we're not doing that, we're not doing what's in the best interest of our company and its stakeholders. So it is very similar to what Keith said.
Bob, I'm going to make sure Judith gets the last word, so I'm going to ask you to go.
I'm going to be quick, Samir. Diversity or business death? Again, I think the free market is going to force diversity. And if you force regulation, it's going to have unintended consequences. It is evolving naturally, beautifully. Let it go.
Judith, perhaps we can hear what you think the future should look like.
So I agree with what's said. I think it's really important that we look at 100% of our talent and not just 49% or 78%, but we're looking for our talent to drive our companies forward, both at the board level, the management level, and at the front lines. I think that's really important. I also think that my hope for the future is in 3 to 5 years, we're no longer talking about we've got 3 diverse candidates or 2 diverse candidates or 4 diverse candidates, and that every director is a diverse director. And I sort of, in my own mind, I don't have that turtle on a post, but I have an orchestra analogy. And I sort of think as a diverse board is like an orchestra. There's 4 primary families of instruments. There's the wind, there's the string, there is the percussion, and you don't want an orchestra of just string instruments. What you want is an orchestra of a few string and a few woodwind and a few percussion. And it really doesn't matter whether you have 2 of one and 3 of another and 5 of another. You have a variety of instruments and they learn to play together. And so I'd like to see a board of directors being a little bit of everything that represents our employees, our customers, our suppliers, that they blend well, and together they're creating good strategy and helping the management team execute that strategy. So that's my vision for what a board looks like in the future. We're no longer talking about diversity because we're all diverse.
That's a great analogy, Judith, not just because I actually would enjoy listening to an orchestra, but because I think it's very apt. So thank you for that. I remember that one as well as Keith's turtle on a post. Not sure how I'm going to fit them in, but I'm going to try. So thank you so much for answering my questions, but I do want to spend some time now addressing some of the questions we've been receiving from folks who are joining us today. And I want to thank all of them for taking the time to share their questions with us. I'm going to be looking off to the side of my screen. It's not that I'm distracted or or playing Candy Crush. I'm actually trying to read the questions that are coming in. So maybe I'll start with this one. All of you have talked about how it's clear diversity can benefit the company and shareholders. But someone has asked, there seems to be a sense, maybe in public, maybe in retail market or pockets of society, that diversity only benefits diverse people. How do we go about changing that thought? So maybe I'll ask Sarah, if you can start us off with your thoughts on that.
It's a tough question. I do think that, I'm always someone who, when someone comes to me to say, do you know a person that ... can get on a board, even if they ask for a female or a racially diverse, what I do is I look at what are you looking for, and if a white male is also qualified for that, I'm going to give you a white male name too. For me, it's overarching. We're trying to get the best possible talent, and so I don't typically classify. I certainly don't think of a white male as lesser than a white female or a black female or a Hispanic male. I just don't think that way. And so I think really communicating the value of that diversity, allowing people to experience the value of having diverse perspectives and thinking through that actually proves itself.
Judith, if you could share maybe your thoughts on that question, I'd appreciate it.
I think it's an excellent question. I think that we've long talked about diversity, even when boards were all white males. We talked about diversity. We talked about the importance of having a financial expert. That was some of the diversity brought onto the board. We needed a QFE, and we believed when we brought a QFE on that it was helping investors, it was helping the corporation, it was helping suppliers, it was good for everybody. But it's now when we're talking about gender or ethnicity or other forms of diversity that we all start to get a bit uncomfortable and say, well, is it helping everybody or just the diverse candidate? I think it's an excellent question, but that's how I frame it, is we don't feel those same levels of discomfort when we bring on other forms of diversity.
Keith, anything you would like to add or share with us?
Yeah, I think the issue, I tie it to sustainability, and it sort of goes to Bob's point that, the market will weed out those who can't survive. And I really think that diversity is a prerequisite to survival. If you look at mining, and I talked about the history of mining, mostly male, from the region where it was being operated. You can prove pretty easily to the 90% of your underground miners who are male that if they don't start attracting female candidates, the mine is going to fail, cease to exist. It's just, in lots of parts of, Saskatchewan where I live, Caucasian male farmers who worked at the mine as well was pretty much the only source of employment. That's not the case anymore. So it goes to the point of proving not just to the diverse candidates, but to the existing pool of talent, that if they don't look at this, it becomes a sustainability issue. And without sustainability, you don't have a job or an investment. So I think I go to Bob's point. The market will weed out those who don't address this. This is a serious issue that needs to be tackled.
Thanks, Keith. Bob, I'm going to ask you a different question that's just come in because I think it's right up your alley here. Someone has asked, how do we reconcile the idea that we don't want a check the box approach with the risk of then just having boilerplate disclosure where people copy, you see the same disclosure across all issuers? How do we walk that fine line?
Because the world's changing, Samir. You're not in a bubble anymore, and we are a trading nation. Watch a political landscape. Everything is changing. What hasn't changed is the flow of capital is still old stock Canadians. That's what hasn't changed. So as long as the flow of capital is does not change, the rest of the flow won't change. And which correlates the last question, diversify, or it's death. It's not a gray zone. It's pretty black and white to me. Like, why would, Samir, okay, let me answer a direct question. Why would I have 2 pages in my annual report, which we've done naturally for the last 20 years, but we are now celebrating inclusiveness, diversity, LGBT, gender equality. We're celebrating it. Before, we didn't celebrate it. We just, kept creating double-digit returns year after year, but now we're celebrating it. And I think that's what the pivotal change is celebration of inclusiveness and diversity. It was almost like a nasty word that you don't want to talk about diversity a few years ago.
So Bob, if I'm hearing you, it sounds like what you're saying is that it's really just about, it's a mindset issue, that you can avoid the boilerplate disclosure if the mindset within the culture of the organization is diversity is valuable, because then you'll celebrate it, not because it's required, but because you believe it. Is that fair?
I'm more passionate, Samir. I said you diversify, or it's death for your business.
So you think the business risks itself will drive belief in disclosing in a valuable way and in a meaningful way what diversity means to your organization?
How else do you define death? It's a global village. Our whole fabric of a nation has changed. It's changed. It's like, that's a discussion we should have had 5 years ago. And it's changing rapidly. Please take a minute out, Samir, and see there are 2 pages of our annual report and watch a diverse team. But that's not a recent phenomenon, because ESG is a popular buzzword this year. That is a 20-year-old story that we are celebrating today.
Don't worry, Bob. I'll be asking our continuous disclosure folks to take a look at your disclosure. There's an interesting question that's come in that I think I'd like to put to all of you, quite frankly, because it's probably applicable for all of you. Are you hearing different things from institutional investors than from retail investors, if you're hearing from retail investors, either directly or through some form of channel? That's an interesting question to me. Judith, could I ask you to maybe speak to that one first?
Certainly the institutional investors are putting a greater focus on whether it be diversity or sustainability, and I think they're all linked, and they're putting a greater focus on whether they're in conversations with us or whether they're in conversations through their disclosure and through their public information. I'm not hearing as much from retail investors, but most of my organizations don't have a large retail base.
Keith, could I ask you maybe to comment on that question?
Yeah, I can't add a lot more than what Judith mentioned. I think the biggest thing that, as a director of a public company is what the proxy advisors are going to do. They're always looking for an easy way to sort of put everybody on a grid and make the recommendation. And I think, we're really keeping a close eye as a board, as I think all boards are, on where they're going to go with this, because you want their assessment and what measures they put forward to be meaningful. And, you don't want to go back to the point where you're just trying to please the proxy advisor without really supporting the interest of your company. So I'm sort of with Judith. I don't have a lot of exposure to retail, but I think the proxy advisors is what I'm personally keeping an eye on, where they're going to go with this issue.
If I can just jump one more time back in, Samir, picking up from what Keith said in proxy advisors, the proxy advisors have been very clear over the last 2 years that they will withhold votes for chairs or chairs of committees if they feel that those organizations don't have enough gender diversity. And we can see the correlation between their very strong stance and the number of new seats or vacant seats that are being appointed by women. So there is a correlation. We see a significant increase in gender diversity on boards in the last 2 years.
That's very helpful. Bob, maybe you can weigh in. I don't know if there's anything you can add, but I certainly appreciate if you took a shot at it.
I think I've taken up too much of your time, Samir.
That's generous of you. Sarah, maybe, is there anything else you could add for us?
The only perspective I could add is something that Bob actually said. Like this is a topic that's important, that's being discussed everywhere, and you've got to believe that if it affects the thought of retail investors also. So no direct knowledge of that, but that would be my comment.
I appreciate that. Another question that's come in that I think is an important one. I'd certainly like to hear your perspectives on this. It's not different so much as perhaps a different take on things. What about the role of diversity and issuers and Indigenous reconciliation? Should there be specific disclosure that speaks to that issue in light of the history of this country and in light of some of the conversations that are happening? I think that's an important question. And perhaps, Bob, I'll start with you this time and see if you can weigh in on this one.
Thank you, Samir. If it's genuine, if it really is trying to reconcile, English is my third language, okay, Samir, so you got to. So I say yes to the Indigenous issues, but I just feel it's not sincere. We do a lot of talking and the problems aren't going away. Keith would be better because he's at the hub of it, but I see there's a lot of political whitewashing that happens on a lot of issues. And this is an issue that I am really concerned about and I'm really sincere about. And I just feel that we talk a lot and nothing happens. Keith, please weigh in on this.
Yeah, I could write a book on this subject. I think you're right, Bob. I think we talk a lot, and no disrespect for the, Samir, the opening comment about, the land recognition. It seems to be what everybody's doing these days. But I've talked to a few friends and I've said those are fine as long as people understand what they're saying and why. But, I would sooner somebody open a meeting with a comment, something to the effect of, I encourage our federal government, provincial governments, and First Nations governments to get K-8 right so we can deal with the disparity of Indigenous people's economic and social outcome. Like that is an opening statement that I would love to hear. And if we can make it sincere and really understand the issues and the primary issues, it's not about land recognition, it's about equality of opportunity, and you start it with just basic education. So, when it gets to director level, recently, I think the numbers have popped up significantly in the last little while, like they've doubled, but they're still like 8. But in Canada and public, big board publicly listed companies, I think a couple of years ago, there was 3 people and I was one of them and I knew the other 2 personally. So, people said, how many Indigenous directors should there be in Canada? And I said, I don't know what the right number is. I don't separate all the issues I talked about diversity earlier from the Indigenous issues, but I do know that 3 is not enough and 8 is probably not enough. There's a lot more talent out there. And I think people are just missing the talent. But it comes to, a lot of comments that others made, people don't know where Indigenous people are or who they are. And if you don't connect with them on a real level and understand the real issues, you're not going to connect with them. So it comes back to this bigger recognition issue and the diverse boards issue. They're not disconnected. So I think that, there's lots more I could say. I'm not going to monopolize, but I think it's a big issue. And if you look at the land issues in Western Canada, great opinion piece in the Globe Mail this week by JP Gladue, who's one of the 8 public company directors I know. that talked about, this misunderstanding about land rights and who speaks on behalf of First Nations people. If you're going to understand that as any kind of resource company in Western Canada, having some perspective from Indigenous people in your employee group, your management, or your board is absolutely essential.
Well, that's great. I'm mindful of the time, so perhaps if I could ask if there's anything that Judith or Sarah you'd like to add in a short fashion, and then we'll be able to wrap up today's conversation.
I can't add anything to what Keith said. I thought he was very eloquent and is speaking from his lived experience, which I don't have.
I agree.
Well, Keith, thank you for sharing that. The main purpose of this entire conversation was for a real conversation, one where experiences were shared, what's actually happening at the table, not a theoretical conversation. So I want to thank each of you for taking the time to be part of this conversation, for bringing your experiences to the table, for being prepared to share them and have a conversation, to have to listen to me, which was probably perhaps the most painful part of this entire exercise for you. But I really want to thank you for your time and effort. This is an important conversation. It's one that we want to continue to have, both as a securities regulator and as a broader piece of the corporate environment. I'd like to thank all the folks who joined us today for this conversation, and all of you who put your questions through and raised some important issues for this panel to consider. This will be a continuing conversation. It does not end. The purpose of today was to put some of those issues on the table for all of us to think about, and to think about what we can do in terms of being a part of what goes forward and the visions that each of you talked about. So thanks to all of you again. Thanks for joining us. And I hope all of you have a wonderful weekend. Take care.
Thank you, Samir, and everybody else. Take care.